all the best.
Thank you.
Infantry, not just in the battle, but in the broader campaign. We're going to split this up into two pieces with a health break in between to allow us sufficient time to take a look at first at the air dimension and then at the infantry section. The biographies of our two speakers today, or of our four speakers today, are in the program. Impressive they are. You have an opportunity. I think all four are well known to the audience here. Let me begin with Dr. Mike Bechthold from Wilfrid Laurier, who's going to speak about the evolution of the air campaign.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank David and Holger and Nancy and the rest of the crew here for having me here and putting on such a wonderful conference. And what I want to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes is change the discussion a little bit. We've heard about the Army, we've heard about the Navy. Well, let's go into the third dimension and hear about the Air Force. The First World War was the first major conflict where air power played a role. And I want to explore a little bit about what was happening at Arras, at Vimy, in April 1917. The two battles, or the battle at Arras and Vimy, are often thought about as an air battle and a land battle, and we don't often sort of put the two together, and I think that's unfortunate. The chief contribution of the airmen was to service the guns through reconnaissance and directing the fall of shot. Bloody April was the worst month of the war for the Royal Flying Corps, the RFC, and it was highlighted by the dominance of Manfred von Richthofen, the emergence of Billy Bishop, and the death of Albert Ball. And that's often what we get in terms of our understanding of air power, those sort of big stories, those narratives, and we don't look at sort of what was going on. It was tales of great bravery in the face of daunting odds when a working machine doing Army support work will never have a chance against the Flying Scout. It was the story of the lions and the donkeys in the air. It was a bloody time for the RFC. In March 1917, during the lead-up to the battle, the RFC lost more aircraft and pilots than it had during all of 1915, and the worst of the Fokker scourge. April was even worse. The RFC suffered a staggering 421 casualties during the month. 207 of those were fatal. By the end of May, total casualties for the year were 1,014, and nearly half of those were fatal. These numbers paled in comparison to the butcher's bill being paid by the men on the ground, but they were crippling nonetheless for the air services. What was the point of it? At Arras, we see the genesis of the modern air campaign. Protecting the aircraft and air crews supporting the artillery was the central mission of the Royal Flying Corps, but how that mission was achieved was much more complicated. By 1917, the ground and air battles were inextricably linked. Major General Hugh Trenchard, who was the officer commanding the Royal Flying Corps in France, developed a multifaceted approach. Aerial reconnaissance provided crucial information for planning the battle, bombing raids were staged to interdict the battlefield, and attempts were made to destroy the Germans by blinding their kite balloons. During the battle itself, contact flights ranged over the battle space to provide updates on the progress of troops. Continuous air patrols were flown to help direct the artillery fire, and German targets in the communication zones were bombed. This was in addition to the fight for air superiority that was taking place over the battlefield. The RFC made a significant contribution to the outcome of the Battle of Arras. A recent history concludes that though the air campaign had been expensive, there was, quote, consolation in the knowledge that without the air effort, there would have been no success on the ground. Trenchard was the architect of the air offensive at Arras, and he's been widely criticized by both his own airmen and by later historians. It's clear that he had been seduced by the cult of the offensive, a strategy that he employed throughout the war. Since its formation, the RFC had valued offensive action over a defensive posture. This plan was formalized by Trenchard during the Somme campaign when he published Future Policy in the Air. This oft-quoted document established that British aviation should be guided by, quote, a policy of relentless and incessant offensive. The French experience at Verdun in 1916 provided the operational laboratory which proved Trenchard's offensive air strategy. Trenchard was in close contact with the French throughout the battle. The French offensive air actions early in the battle gave them the advantage, but it was lost when they emphasized defensive missions. Faced with mounting casualties, the French air commander made the bold decision to return to offensive operations. His scout squadrons were released to take the battle to the enemy. It worked. As one commentator remarked, quote, offensive action did in fact seem to be the key to gaining air superiority. Trenchard used these hard-won lessons to guide the British air campaign at the Somme in the summer and fall of 1916. As he stated, survival in three-dimensional warfare depended on maintaining the offensive, whatever the odds, whatever the cost. For the first time in the history of air warfare, an air campaign was planned and executed to support a major army campaign. Although the RFC suffered serious losses because it rigidly adhered to this offensive strategy during the air campaign, when the battle ended, the RFC was still in control of the skies over the Somme. The ground campaign is generally considered a failure, but historians look at the air campaign as a success for the Royal Flying Corps. Unfortunately, between the summer of 1916 and the spring of 1917, there were significant changes in the balance of power in the air. German technological superiority improved, and the current generation of German scouts were faster, more maneuverable, and packed greater firepower than most of their British counterparts. British machines, especially the obsolescent DH-2 and BH-2, were well past their prime. The main British scouts, like the FE-2B and 2D, the FE-8, and the Sopwith 1.5 strutter, were similarly overmatched. The Sopwith Pup and the Newport 17 were not a bad match, but it was only the Sopwith triplane that could honestly beat the Germans at that point in the war. The RFC placed great hope in new aircraft arriving on the battlefield, especially the Bristol fighter, the SC-5, and the RE-8. And these aircraft would eventually turn the tide in the air, but at Arras they weren't quite ready. They were ineffective due to technical shortcomings and tactical mishandlings. Planning for the Arras offensive started in late 1916, and Trenchard lobbied hard to improve his squadrons. In January 1917, he possessed 39 squadrons ready for operations, but less than a third were capable of escort operations, offensive patrols, and general air combat. Trenchard was promised new squadrons by March, but they were slow to arrive. The only notable reinforcement during this period was the commitment of the Royal Naval Air Service squadrons to the battle. There were also serious questions regarding the quality of British aircraft in the first half of 1917. The rapid expansion of the RFC, along with heavy training and operational losses, created a shortfall in the availability of well-trained pilots and observers. The problem was compounded by inadequate training methods and a shortage of effective training aircraft. As a result, pilots were arriving at the front not prepared for combat. In spite of these challenges, Trenchard pursued his offensive strategy at Arras. As he saw it, air superiority was the key to winning the air battle. On 26 March, Trenchard issued orders for the Arras offensive to his brigades. Quote, "The aim of our offensive will be to force the enemy to fight well behind and not on the lines. Offensive patrols were to be pushed deep into Army reconnaissance areas, and commanders were to refuse requests for the close protection of corps machines, except in special circumstances." The order specifically referenced RFC success on the Somme, and Trenchard was, quote, "confident that a similar ascendancy will be gained this year." He had reason for optimism. He lacked quality, but not quantity. At the start of the battle, the RFC strength on the 1st and 3rd Army fronts was 25 squadrons and 465 aircraft. More than a third of these were single-seat fighters. By comparison, the German 6th Army had a strength of only 195 aircraft, and less than half of these were suitable for air combat. The RFC plan for the air battle at Arras contained many of the hallmarks of a modern air campaign. Trenchard's offensive spirit was the driving factor, but his plan offered a nuanced and flexible approach to control the airspace and permit the essential tasks of artillery spotting and reconnaissance to proceed unhindered. The high casualties of Bloody April arose due to a confluence of uncontrollable factors rather than the adherence and application of rigid and unimaginative tactics by Trenchard and the RFC. Air operations began in support of the battle on the 5th of April. Trenchard intended to isolate the battlefield through medium and long-distance bombing attacks. In addition to denigrating the German ability to move reserves around the battlefield, the attacks were aimed to draw both anti-aircraft guns and fighters away from the front lines. In the 4 days before the commencement of the ground assault, attacks were made on railway stations and railway junctions, engine depots, ammunition dumps, troop billets, and villages. Key German aerodromes were repeatedly attacked at all hours, and there were also 2 attempts to decapitate the German army by attacking the headquarters of Crown Prince Ruprecht, the army group commander opposing the British at Arras. There's no indication that these preliminary attacks proved anything more than a minor annoyance to the Germans, but they demonstrated the evolution of British thinking about how to conduct an air campaign at the operational level. British and Canadian artillery were very successful in the opening stages of the attack, and much of this success was due to the close partnership with the RFC. Bill March, my colleague, will be discussing this in the next paper. The start of the ground assault on 9 April saw the RFC enter the next stage of their battle plan, where the intent was to control German airspace over the battle area. To achieve this, overlapping zones of control were established, which would be continuously patrolled to keep the enemy at bay. The deepest zone of distant offensive patrols extended 15 to 25 miles from the front in the area beyond Douai and Cambrai. Just beyond the front was a zone of close offensive patrols. Corps 2-seater aircraft then patrolled on top of the lines. The goal was to saturate the area, making it impossible, or at least very dangerous, for German aircraft to penetrate and interfere with the work of the Army's support aircraft. The program was very successful. At the very start of the offensive on 9 April, the RFC had 48 single-seat fighters patrolling the close offensive zone and 24 two-seat fighters engaged in line patrols. In addition, aircraft from 2 squadrons operated in the distant offensive zone beyond Douai and Cambrai. This was the ideal offensive concentration and largely prevented casualties amongst the core machines. On 9 April, the RFC reported that hostile aircraft were active but often avoided combat, something they did when the odds were not in their favor. Unfortunately, it was difficult to maintain this saturation of the battle space due to periodic shortages of pilots and machines, weather, wastage, and aircrew limitations, among other factors. One historian calculated that to continuously patrol the 310 square kilometer zone throughout the day would require an average of about 300 to 400 sorties, or one flight by one aircraft. But a survey of RFC brigade summaries showed that more than 300 sorties were flown on only 2 days in April, and 250 sorties were flown on only 9 days. So as the historian concluded, in these stark statistics lay the seeds of disaster. While these counter-air operations took place, the RFC continued to fly interdiction missions to isolate the battlefield and draw off German resources. Each day, when the weather permitted, aircraft were dispatched to hit a variety of near and distant targets, aerodromes, rail yards, troop concentrations, and other high-value targets. Many of these raids were sent unescorted, and no difficulties happened, but when they were intercepted by the Germans, there were heavy losses. These attacks did show, however, that offensive bombing raids, though at times costly, could draw German fighters away from the front lines. Weather was a major challenge faced by the RFC in March and April. The Canadian Corps contended with snow squalls at Vimy, and this weather also impacted flying operations. By the beginning of April, it was apparent that flying weather would be less than ideal, but Trenchard urged that, quote, importance, in spite of this, of seizing every opportunity of displaying the utmost vigor whenever weather gives the slightest chance for it. The bombing offensive was scheduled to begin on the 4th of April, but it was delayed 24 hours by weather. On 9 April, the RFC reported that the snow was at times blinding and a strong southwest gale blew at altitude. This prompted the abandonment of the entire bombing program on the day of the attack and limited the number of offensive patrols. As historians of the Normandy campaign have observed, what is good tank country can be even better anti-tank country, and the same can be said of good flying weather. A slackening in the snow squalls on the 11th of April increased the RFC sortie rate, but there was a corresponding increase in German activity. By the end of the day, 15 aircraft had been lost. Friday the 13th again brought ideal flying weather and heavy losses. Another 18 aircraft failed to return home. So what can we conclude about the air effort at Arras? An oft-repeated criticism of the inflexibility of the overall plan, tied as it was to Trenchard's cult of the offensive. One historian argued that Trenchard and other leaders of the RFC were directly responsible for the high aircrew casualties because they, quote, failed to modify or adjust their thinking in terms of strategy they directed the RFC to adhere to, most especially when the German air service began to achieve dominance in the skies over the Somme in the autumn of 1916. But this was simply not the case. It's essential to distinguish between Trenchard's rhetoric and RFC actual practice. Trenchard and his commanders made numerous changes to his tactics during the battle to mitigate losses. Scout aircraft didn't fly in close support of artillery machines, but their missions were synchronized to achieve the same results. Escorts were provided for vulnerable bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, especially those that were near obsolescence. A bombing rate of 6 BE-2s would have close support provided by 6 FE-2Bs, as well as a more distant escort of 6 additional scouts, such as Pups and Newports. So 6 bombing aircraft would have 12 or more fighters in support. Photographic missions were almost always supported heavily, and it was not unusual to have as many as 15 aircraft directly supporting a photographic element of only 3 aircraft. So the idea that Trenchard's offensive policy meant that vulnerable aircraft were left alone in the zone of contact is not supported by the evidence. Losses in the RFC are often used to frame the air power experience at Arras, but perhaps it's more instructive to look at accomplishments. Towards the end of April, Major General Kegel, Haig's Chief of Staff, issued a summary of air operations which offer a telling portrait of success in the air campaign. If you look at the number of batteries which were engaged by aircraft, it was 767 by the British. If you look at British targets engaged by the Germans, supported by aircraft, it was 160. 5,200 photographs were taken, 124,000 prints were made of those photographs. British artillery machines made 842 sorties to support artillery fire, and German machines only made 320 sorties to do the same job. And the number of our machines which crossed the lines on offensive missions was 5,000 aircraft. The number of German machines that came back over British lines was 500. And probably the most remarkable statistic is that the number of aircraft the British had on their front on the 9th of April was 887 aircraft, and 2 weeks later, on the 19th of April, the number had actually increased, and there were 890 British aircraft engaged at Arras. So despite the heavy losses in men and machines, the RFC was able to increase its squadrons in the field and increase its net strength. So in these statistics can be found the true contribution of the RFC to the Arras battle. Though the cost was great, the RFC was able to effectively support the Army, its prime mission, throughout the battle. No less an authority than Field Marshal Haig told the War Office in London on the 18th of May 1917 that the success of the artillery and infantry during the Arras offensive rested entirely on the efforts of the artillery cooperation in squadrons of the RFC. The heavy British losses of Bloody April were not the result of Trenchard's single-minded pursuit of offensive operations. Rather, for the RFC, the Battle of Arras was a perfect storm of problems. Its inopportune timing was dictated by the need to support the French offensive in the Chemin des Dames, even though the RFC was not ready for sustained operations at that point. The German technological ascendancy in the sky, which had grown since the end of the Somme campaign, was at its apex. British squadrons were filled with obsolete and overmatched aircraft, and many of its pilots and observers were ill-trained and unprepared for combat. Newer types were arriving, but those aircraft still had technical issues to sort out, and pilots were still learning how to fight them effectively. Weather was also a major factor and impacted operations in a significant way. So April 1917 was the costliest month of the war for the RFC, but it really marked a turning point in air operations. The RFC continued to learn how to wage war in the air, but even more importantly, it was learning how to effectively fight an air campaign. The many disparate functions of air warfare, tactical and operational reconnaissance, artillery spotting, interdiction, trench strafing, were all being used to great effect. Trenchard and the other commanders of the RFC were learning how to integrate these various missions so that the sum was greater than the parts. There were problems yet to be worked out, but the path forward was clear and would culminate in August 1918 at the Battle of Amiens, which featured the greatest air concentration of any battle of the First World War and set the standard for air campaigns in future wars. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that strong introduction. Bill?
Can I get my presentation? Recognizing full well that at this time of the day, not only is my job to provide information, it's also to provide a modicum of entertainment. So, David, everyone, thank you very much. I want to congratulate you. I think we should have actually more conferences where we actually look at any sort of conflict or operation or battle from both sides, because very often I find that we toot our own horn without finding exactly what the enemy thought of us when we were doing our thing. So, a not significant contribution, and in case you don't know, that's an FE aircraft there. And if you take a look at the 3 machine guns they have on it, that's basically to counter the German superiority in firepower. When you take a look at air operations and air support to the Army, it's very much not what you have done for me, it's what have you done for me lately. And you'll find that the story of air-land cooperation in the First World War and subsequent wars is, all right, you did well in that last time. If we have a problem next time, it must be your fault. And in notice of full disclosure, if you take a look at that, I'm an observer. Ergo, I will lie to you either consciously or unconsciously for the course of this presentation. Now, this individual was the Chief Intelligence Officer of the First Army. He will go on to become Haig's Chief Intelligence Officer. And he will the one that 28 days after the opening salvos of the Battle of the Somme will blame the Royal Flying Corps for the lack of progress of the British Army on the ground because we failed to detect all of the desperate German resistance that they actually encountered. So I find that actually quite interesting. Basically, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Corps Air Cooperation Reconnaissance. We're going to talk about shoots. We're going to talk a little bit about contract patrols. We're going to talk about those unsung Air Force heroes, the balloonists, and we're going to talk a little bit about the cost. You will not see a headquarters wiring diagram in my presentation, and you'll not hear me talk about fighter pilots at all in this conversation. Okay? We're going to talk about reconnaissance. All the images you see here were taken on the 8th of April, 1917, and they're all from a height of about 1,500 meters. That's what an artillery round going off is, but you can see the level of detail that you can see over the front at Vimy. Basically, a core squadron area would be divided into these 3 areas. You have C flight, A flight, B flight. C flight's got a depth of about 1,000 feet. They're really focused on the frontline trenches, whereas A and B flight would be going in the back. A and B flight would do most of the shoots, most of the artillery preparation, whereas C flight would take a look at shoots that involve the trenches and sort of the stuff that they needed to do to support the actual assault. 16 Squadron, which will be the RFC squadron supporting the Canadian Corps primarily, will have 24 aircraft broken up into 8 aircraft per flight, and that's going to be their basic mode of operation here. They're going to operate the BE-2 in one of its configurations. The BE-2 was a lovely aircraft, very stable, very nice to fly, and it was a great aircraft if you owned the sky. It was not a great aircraft if you didn't own the sky. And it was not a well-designed aircraft for aerial observation. The pilot sat in the back, the observer sat in the front. The observer could not observe because he had wings underneath him, planes underneath him, had all these wires, so it was up to the pilot to see exactly what they were doing. Nor could the observer really defend the aircraft because, as you see, they had only one machine gun. It was pointed backward towards the pilot, which I thought was a brilliant idea. But his scope of operation was lessened by the fact that if he didn't point it in the right directions, he would shoot off his own tail and perhaps shoot the pilot as well, too. But this will be the mainstay of the RFC in 1917. Whenever we think of air power, we think of airplanes, but you can't just think of airplanes when it comes to technology. You've got to think of the technology that goes on the airplanes that does this. Firepower we've already mentioned, but the camera is arguably one of the greatest weapons of war in the First World War, and yet we haven't devoted a lot of time to look at the development of camera. So you've got the handheld and the mounted camera. Both of these are going to play an unbelievably large role in the First World War. This is my only wiring diagram. It's got nothing to do with headquarters. This is the flow of aircraft photos back from a squadron all the way back down to the company. Just to show you exactly how fast they could distribute these particular photos and the technology that went into this. This rather grainy picture is a picture of a mobile photographic development van. So these vans would be stationed at headquarters or forward operating fields so that as soon as the airplane landed, their images could get developed and dispatched as quickly as possible. And they actually used dispatch riders to do it. So during experimentations, from the time they launched the aircraft, they took the photo, brought the photo back, got it developed, and got it to the people who needed it, they got it down to as low as 30 minutes in perfect times. I don't think we can do that today with computers, but they could do it 30 minutes in those days. And this gives you an idea of some of, again, this is the front line over Vimy. This gives you some of the idea of some of the photos at 4,000 feet. Pretty good. Support trenches, communication trenches, and part of what's left of the village of Vimy. So reconnaissance, photographic reconnaissance, is going to be a big, big part of the air support that's going to be provided. Another thing that all of these photos did was it allowed the squadron to build up a mosaic of the front line. And because you have so many new crew come in as casualties happen during combat and stuff, these photographic mosaics allowed the squadron to quickly bring their people up to speed to get them familiar with the territory they're going to have to fly over. And this gives you an idea, based from RFC communiques, not the greatest source, but not bad. This gives you an idea of how many photographs that were taken. I don't have anything from the 9th to 12th of April. Not that there were no photographs taken. It's just I just can't find the data. But it gives you an idea of how many photographs are going to be taken. And Mike has already mentioned how many thousands and thousands of prints were already made there. So now I'm going to talk about artillery. Basically, artillery air cooperation, from the Canadian perspective, is an evolutionary, not a revolutionary process. When the Canadians entered the war, we had no experience with using aircraft. God forbid the Burgess Dunn would have actually flown in combat, but it never did. So what basically, you don't see the Canadian artillery dealing with aircraft until they're training on a Salisbury plane, and then only a handful of batteries would have actually trained with aircraft. And along with this evolutionary process of aircraft dealing with artillery, you also had a similar process happening with the intelligence organization, the mapping and planning organizations that are going on. So it's all these things that have to evolve at the same time to make the air-land cooperation very, very effective. Finally, by April 1916, you start to get reports of batteries and things on the Canadian Corps saying, where the hell are my photographs? I want my photographs. Now they're starting to get used to them. Okay? Liaison became very important, which I find fascinating because the Royal Flying Corps of the day is composed primarily of Army people that saw the light and transferred to the Air Force. And yet they don't speak the same language. And I find that amazing. So liaison from artillery to squadron, squadron to headquarters was very, very important. Maps and accuracy. You could have a whole presentation on just the development of maps and how you had to develop a map system of the squares and things to allow you the accuracy to pinpoint where the artillery is going to go. Currie and McNaughton. Currie, we've already heard how he was he learned a lot from the Somme campaign and the French in Verdun. Well, he also learned the importance of training when it came to the Army working with the RFC and vice versa. And McNaughton, same side of the house, when he finally became the counter battery officer for the Corps, he also attended lectures and everything that allowed him to understand the importance of the aerial reconnaissance for what he had to do. Something as simple as the clock code, right, developed by an RFC lieutenant back in 1914, revolutionized air-land cooperation when it came to artillery. Here, the German battery, very small at this point, in the center of the code. The numbers give you the direction, and the ABCD tells you how far away from your target the artillery share has landed. 3 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps actually developed this, and they were tasked to experiment with this to see if it worked. And I mentioned how a learning organization must also capitalize on success as much as they do failure. Well, in this case, they tried it, it worked, they experimented with a couple of corps, and they went, right, let's put this into play. Now, we always think it must be so easy for the buggers in the airplane to do this. And then you take a look at this gentleman, Cecil Lewis, who wrote a great book called Sagittarius Rising, which I think you should read if you want to understand sort of the air campaign from the point of view of somebody who's actually fighting it. But if you take a look at this, you get an understanding of all of the issues involved in actually doing a shoot. And a shoot is a very coordinated, planned operation. This is what a shoot looks like. If you're starting from the star, that's the order, fire. After he fires, the aircraft flies across that solid line and he's observing. While he's observing, by the way, he's unrolling 120 feet or so of copper wire with a lead weight. That's his antenna. On his way back, he transmits his corrections. Hopefully they've been received. He flies up there, and he transmits any final things, and they start the whole process again. Very organized, very methodical, very easy for a German fighter to shoot the bugger down because they know exactly what he's doing. And as I've been told or seen from anecdotal evidence, if you have to maneuver in defense, having 120 feet of weighted wire under your aircraft, not a good thing. This is the receiver of the day, the transmitter, the wireless of the day. Very good for Morse code. 16 words a minute was what they looked for, which meant that 12 minutes was what you probably got in the air, or if you were scared shitless and you were sick, probably a lot less than that. Okay? But with the wireless things, you had wireless at the squadron, you had wireless at the batteries, but you also had a central wireless organization that monitored everything. And they would check to see if everything was working well, and if it didn't, they would step in to see how they could help out. Okay? Basically, by 1917, by the time the Corps is going to go over the top, the Canadian Corps, roughly 90% of the counter-battery operations are going to have aerial observation involved. Now, how important is this? Well, you'll see in a minute, but if you take a look at some of the difficulties, this is Captain Roth from 16 Squadron. So he's talking about doing shoots supporting the Canadian Corps. And you're going to see some of these things. All these issues are going to happen, whether it's the artillery doesn't trust us, we don't trust the artillery, whether it's bogus information, bad equipment, whether it's the fact there's a German aircraft in the air when we want the artillery to shoot, because they won't shoot, because then the Germans will report back to their batteries, and they'll refuse. So all of these things are going to impact the poor buggers that are in the air. And I realize I'm going fast, but I only have 20 minutes. We talked about weather. Weather did not stop the guys from going up during the battle at Vimy. All it did was made it a much more interesting experience for them. In this case, when you've got an open cockpit and you're flying through hail, I don't have that experience, and I don't recommend it to anybody either. But for someone who's amused by watching it bounce off his nose onto the windscreen, zone calls. Zone calls are completely different from shoots. What a zone call is basically they've detected a battery. They don't know exactly, they haven't noticed it before. So what they do is they pinpoint it on the map, and then there's a preset number of artillery batteries that are on a zone call, and the aircraft makes that call, and then these guys fire. They either fire until the aircraft has said, yes, you've destroyed the target, or they fire until they finished off their allocated number of ammunition. Scientifically, they calculated how many of different calibers of ammunition would take to knock out a battery. And here's the 9th of April, 16 Squadron directing a zone call. I'm not sure how much fun it was in an aircraft watching all those shells go over, but that's not me. These are, again, for communiques, for the shoots that the RFC would have conducted in the lead up to the Battle of Arras and Vimy. Notice it's 84 from 9 to 12 of April during the actual battle. Again, that's simply because of the fewer number of aircraft, but also because at that particular point in time, the batteries they wanted to silence, they would have silenced, and so anything after that would have been zone calls, because those batteries, there would have been new batteries they've seen. This is one artillery thing. Gives you sort of the statistics and where they got the information when they fired. The biggest thing is if you look at 1916 for the 1st Canadian Heavy Battery, very, very few aviation or air-related information came. It was all ground. But if you take a look at 1917, how the patterns have shifted. So if you combine air and balloons, roughly 56, 57% of all the information this particular battery is getting is coming from the air. This goes against what McNaughton wrote after the war when he said, oh, only about 30% of my information came from aerial observations. That's not the statistical data that comes out. So, the proof is in the pudding. Basically, 212 hostile batteries, 180 were located and engaged prior to the assault. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the infantry. This is a contact patrol, figuratively speaking. The soldiers are going over the top, and you've got low-flying aircraft coming in to basically work with the infantry. This is the reconnaissance contact patrol. This basically gives you, in perfect conditions, what you can see from the air. The big one to remember is the one at the bottom, 1,000 feet. where it says friendly troops distinguished from enemy troops, that's crap. Okay? You had to go much lower than that in the middle of all the mud and the shell fire and stuff to see who was wearing gray and who was wearing khaki. Didn't work that way. And this is talking for the Somme. So this is the practice, kindergarten as he calls it, this is the practice with the troops. The troops would basically go out and practice assaulting. When they rotated off the front for rest, they would go through a training period and they would practice assaults. And the aircraft would come over, basically sound its klaxon, and all the officers or the designated soldiers would wave little cloths saying, oh yes, we've set off our flares just like you told us, and now you know where we are. Kindergarten. This is sort of what the standard contact patrol equipment is. Bottom right is a ferry pistol firing flares. Up on the left, it's sort of a rendition of a Bengal flare or a handheld flare. A klaxon horn on the left. My favorite one is the umbrella on the right, because a brilliant British battalion commander thought that because they were having so much trouble seeing the soldiers, he issued his battalion umbrellas. And so when they were supposed to send off their flares, instead, they opened their umbrellas, thinking that from the air, umbrellas would be easier to see. Needless to say, that didn't work. I think the soldiers shot him, and we didn't use umbrellas. Okay. So fundamentally, from the point of view of contact patrols on the Somme, and the reason I mention the Somme is because all of these lessons are going to be taken by Currie and brought into the assault on Arras. Basically, what happened on the Somme is it didn't work. Why didn't it work? For a lot of reasons, even though we own control of the sky. But probably one of the reasons it really didn't work is the 60,000 casualties that they suffered on that first day, everybody carrying flares didn't exist anymore. So when you called for flares and there was no one left to light them, you didn't know where they were. Hey. Part and parcel of the contact patrols, too, was also the Air Force communicating with the Army on the ground. And that said, basically, little messages sent off in cloths or with Morse code and stuff like this. The aircraft would take that message, and then they would deliver it to the battalion or the Corps headquarters as desired. And this is what they used. This is a ubiquitous message bag, right? It's a big weighted lead bag with a handwritten message in the pouch, and you threw it over. And the target that they would be aiming for would be basically a small little group of people. And these are sort of the types of contact patrols that the Royal Flying Corps were going to be flying when it came to the 1st Canadian Division for the assault on Vimy Ridge. So they were going to fly at specific times so that the aircraft could figure out where the troops were and report it back. And I mentioned a target that they were going to look at. Part and parcel of that, too, is you had to make sure that your troops did not shoot you down. So contact patrol aircraft would be marked differently, much like the 3 invasion stripes at D-Day. Unfortunately, the only casualty, contact patrol casualty that the 16th Squadron suffered during the attack on Vimy Ridge, there's anecdotal evidence to point to the fact that Canadians shot it down. So sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Okay? And if you're on the ground, this is what a contact patrol looks like. The one on the left is a contact patrol aircraft. The one on the right is a German aircraft. So I'm not sure if the contact patrol is doing what it's supposed to be doing or running away or whatever. And this is what they were aiming at when they dropped the message bags. This is battalion headquarters. You can tell by the typewriters. No, or not. And a lot of times when you take a look at the histories and things, I was told that because of the weather and stuff, the guys weren't flying in the attack on Vimy Ridge. Nothing can be further from the truth. This is a sampling, if you will, on the 8th and the 9th when they're starting to prepare, and the different organizations that are working with the Flying Corps. So the contact patrols are up there. They're doing their job, regardless if the weather is crappy or not. My favorite, balloons. You can't have a party like Vimy Ridge without a balloon. These are intrepid balloonists. Normally they are Army personnel who volunteered to be transferred to the Royal Flying Corps to serve in balloons. They are also one of the few people on the Allied side who actually get to wear parachutes. Although they only wear the harness, the parachute is actually strapped to the basket. This gives you an idea of how big the basket was that they had to work in and stuff. So in this case, he's carrying a camera. Normally he would carry telephone equipment with a wire going all the way down to the group. This is the kind of fidelity you would get from a camera mounted on a balloon. This is 1,400 feet in the air, and this is the battlefield around Vimy, taken in November 1917. This is why you didn't want to be a balloonist. This particular individual, because they wanted the balloons up, they knew it was der Tag, the day, the assault, and so they wanted to try to see if the balloons would handle the vicious weather and stuff like this. As you can see from this description, it was not a good time to be a balloonist. In this case, the balloon behaved so badly, it pulled the 10-ton vehicle across the length of a football field before the cable snapped. The balloon was drifting into German territory, so the two guys bailed out before they became guests of the Kaiser. And the casualties. 249 aircraft, 319 casualties. And our numbers differ because it depends what source you take a look at. Because of the casualties, lots of individuals were rushed through training. And if you rush through training, you get this lovely experience of having pilots who don't know what they're doing. Work the same way for observers, but I'm picking on pilots today. Okay? And so you have this case of a veteran observer who gets up with a new pilot. And if you want to talk stress, take a look at what this poor bugger experienced during this period. Okay? And this is not a new thing. So what happens in the squadron at this particular point is you have veterans who don't want to fly with the new people because they'll die. So what you get is you get new observers and new pilots going off on their own, and the veterans stay together. And as a result, the majority of casualties you're going to experience are the new people because they don't, there's a reason why we refer to pilot trainees as Huns, because they're a lot more likely to kill you than the enemy at this stage. And I don't have any pictures. I should get some pictures of German anti-aircraft stuff. But this is sort of what the contract patrol and the aircraft would have to deal with. Forward or upward firing machine guns, portable anti-aircraft batteries. And this is what Archie looks like. That's the aircraft out there. This is what Archie looks like. And of course, we have the German Scout. It's amazing if you take a look at the combat reports from the various battalions and companies and stuff, how many times they mention a red airplane. And then finally, the casualties. This is an FE2. There's no such thing as an easy landing ground in no man's land. It just doesn't work. If you're a balloonist, not a good day to be a balloonist. The only Canadian casualty we have is a guy who actually managed to parachute out of a balloon, and then the burning balloon fell on him. But the infantry, being the infantry, appreciated when the Air Force would provide them with a clothes horse or two to dry their clothes. I always thought that was nice. Okay. Quick one, mission, statistic, casualties. You got the types of missions we're on and casualties. The big one to note here is offensive patrols, so scouts, but also the photo reconnaissance, 149 aircraft lost. If you take a look in the brackets, that's basically what happens during Vimy Ridge. You lose 149 aircraft, and they're not all photographic aircraft or reconnaissance aircraft. A lot of those are escort aircraft that go along. Why? Because the scouts are used fundamentally for missions, and we have the photo reconnaissance aircraft being escorted by basically other photo reconnaissance aircraft. It doesn't work out very well. 16 squadron casualties. This is basically the same thing. Fundamentally, half the squadron will disappear from December to April. And this just gives you an idea. Canadian casualties. Pilots 14, observers 15, 14, Royal Naval Observers 4. Interesting enough, out of the 29 Canadian aircrew that are killed, 21 of them had previous experience in the CEF. And finally, to put it all in perspective, during the time we lost 29 people at the front, we had 9 Canadians killed in training. And this just gives you an anecdotal comment on the casualties. Basically, the pilot was killed, and the observer got to ride the aircraft down 4,000 feet. Not a good way to go. Thank you.
Good, great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. They're two very nice complementary pieces to set up a discussion of the air campaign. We have a few minutes for questions before our break. Anyone want to take to the microphones or to try to belt it out? Sir, Colonel?
Hi, gents. Thanks. Great presentation. Question for either of the presenters. I'm curious about the designation of a main effort by the RFC. Did the RFC weight its efforts in the support of any particular formation? And if so, what would that formation have been? Or did it weight its efforts in the pursuit of a particular task, such as counter-battery fire?
Trenchard understood that supporting the Army was the #1 mission. Artillery support, reconnaissance, aerial photography was the #1 mission. But he was edging closer to the realization that the best way to facilitate that is to achieve air superiority. So that's why he had this idea of the offensive. You have to send your fighters deep into enemy territory to knock down the enemy fighters so that you clear the airspace for your own planes. Now, that being said, people focus on Trenchard and his offensive mindedness and kind of lose sight of the fact that he was doing that to facilitate the other part of the equation.
Anyone else? Rob?
Just a little bit of a follow-up question to that. Okay, so we have Trenchard thinking about air power and all his writings after. Is there anyone on the Canadian side at all thinking in terms of air power in any context or is this just simply left with the Brits?
Yeah, you're not going to get a lot of air power thinkers out of the Canadians that fought in the First World War simply because they were more concerned about survival, and not very many of them rose to high rank. I believe it's McLaren, who was a naval pilot and stuff, and he worked with J.A. Wilson after the war to sort of formulate what would become not the strategy, but the policy for the Canadian Air Force and eventually the Royal Canadian Air Force. But you really don't get air power thinkers sort of like Mitchell and Trenchard are the Canadians at that time.
One last question, sir.
Oh, make it a good one.
You have somebody that joins the RFC. He's grass green. What was his training protocol?
I'm sorry?
He's if you got a new pilot, was there a training protocol for them, and how did they then RFC determine whether or not, okay, now you're a pilot?
Okay, basically the training organization in England went through an evolutionary period as well too. But fundamentally, I think one of the biggest things they always thought was you either had it or you didn't. You were either pilot or you weren't a pilot. By 1917, they were just starting into the Gosport system, which is a very regulated, very formatted way of training pilots, but it took a while for it to catch on. So fundamentally, because you needed to fill cockpit seats and observer seats and stuff like this, you could go to the front with as little as under 10 hours time if the trainers thought you had the stuff to do it and stuff. And it was basically attritional training. If you got to the front and you survived, great. If you didn't, well, we got another newbie behind you coming in.
Just as a comment, I had an uncle that flew with Typhoons in World War II, and he flew 177 missions. And he said, if you survived the first 5 missions, you would probably make it because it was a steep learning curve.
Well, people would argue that if you survived the first 5 missions or so, you learned enough to forget everything you were taught and do what the actual job called for.
Well, having survived the first 2 presentations, we'll take the break for a learning opportunity and whatever else needs to be done. Mike and Bill, thank you very much for the setup of the aviation part of the discussion today. We'll take a break, come back at 2 o'clock for the second part of our panel.
Great. Mayor, thanks very much. Good, yeah. I think we worked out well, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second part of our session on the air and infantry. Our first presentation for the second part of this is by William Stewart, who will talk about weapons. His full description of his biography is here. I'm going to let him take as much time as possible and less time for me.
So I think we can all agree that the Canadian Corps was a far more effective formation at Vimy than at the Somme. Its artillery was better, its signals were better, its staff work was better, its infantry was better. But there's an anomaly here in that the infantry weapons used at Vimy were the same used on the Somme, in fact used all the way through to the end of the war. I want to explore this through the notion or the lens of two case studies looking at the introduction of new weapons, but wrapping it in a context of how these weapons are deployed and how they're employed. So what I'm going to do is first start with what do I mean by deployment and employment, and then I'm going to talk about why should we care about infantry weapons in a war dominated by artillery. Then I'm going to give two case studies, the first on the Stokes trench mortar, the second on the Lewis gun, on how they were deployed and employed on the Somme, and then on Vimy, this notion of a learning organization. What has changed? And then tie this all together with a conclusion. Now, there's enormous interest, both popular and academic, in the introduction of new weapons, the design, development, and production. And what you get is the feeds and speeds, the range, magazine capacity, the explosive effect, the number produced. And there's this great interest in this, but whenever a new weapon is introduced, there's a set of decisions that are made on how does it get to the battlefield, how does it get used, that actually define the extent to which those feeds and speeds are realized. What do I mean by this? Well, when you take a look at deployment, the first one I want to talk about is organization. So what's the basic structure of this new weapons unit? Is it units of 2, of 4, 6, and 8? Now, two things to understand about all of these that I'm going to be talking about is that there's a set of trade-offs that are involved. So there is not one canonical correct answer. It depends on your army, the enemy, the terrain, the circumstances, but also the other decisions that you make. And if those decisions are not congruent, you're going to have a failure along the way. So in the case of organization, the trade-off is, well, if you have larger units, easier to control, better ability to mass firepower, but you lose flexibility in the process. Second is, how are the personnel obtained? So in the case of infantry weapons, Lewis guns and grenades are part of the infantry. Trench mortars are personnel that are seconded from the brigade's infantry unit, and machine guns are in a separate corps. How are these units trained? Is it trained in the unit? Are they trained in England? Are they trained in France? Are there special training facilities that are required in order to bring them up to speed? And then the issue of control. Where do they reside? Who owns them? So in the case of the heavy machine gun, it starts off as a battalion asset in 1914, becomes a brigade asset in 1916, and a division by 1918. And when you read the correspondence and the lessons learned, there are complaints at each time that, well, we've lost control, we've lost flexibility, whereas the argument for gathering in larger and larger formations is the ability to control and use them more effectively. Then there's the issue of how are they moved, both administratively and tactically. So in the case of a Lewis gun, when it was first introduced, it is carried on the shoulder of a soldier, both administratively and tactically. Mid-war, there's this ergonomic nightmare of a handcart that's introduced, and by 1918, they have horse-drawn wagons. But in the late spring of 1918, the number of Lewis guns is doubled in a battalion. So the question becomes, do we add additional horse transport? No, there isn't enough horses to do that. So it means that each wagon carries now twice as many guns, which means you carry less ammunition. So there's always these sets of trade-offs. And then probably the biggest handicap for the case of the infantry weapons is logistics. These are all weapons that use lots of ammunition. They're heavy, they're bulky, and they're difficult to move around on the battlefield. So in the case of a Lewis gun and grenades, they're fed through the already existing ammunition columns, but machine guns and trench mortars are kind of residing outside of this system, and there are issues on how do you keep these things supplied. And then finally, how are they maintained? The joke was, a Lewis gun spare parts pouch had enough pieces you could build a second Lewis gun out of. So I'll also give you another example of when you talk about the trade-offs. Now, this is tanks, admittedly not an infantry weapon. When the tanks were first introduced, the workshops were at the company level, then moved to battalion and ended up at brigade as a way of consolidating the limited number of trained manpower. But this creates problems. I was just reading the war diary of a British tank battalion that served with the Canadians at the DQ line at the beginning of September 1918. And it had to sheepishly admit that it could only put 8 tanks into the line. The other 24 tanks that it was supposed to have, it wasn't really sure where they were, because it had fought 3 separate battles with 3 different armies, with 3 different brigades, and the equipment was scattered over northern France. So deployment is an area that doesn't seem to get a lot of interest. Certainly employment or doctrine tactics does. And this is both how weapons are used at a tactical or the unit level, but how do they fit into the larger battle practice? So I'll give you an example. Prior to the German March offensive in 1918, the question within the British Army was, what is the optimal size of a machine gun installation? So the arguments are, if there are more guns in an installation, they can absorb losses, you've got greater concentration of fire, but it means you have fewer posts, you don't have as much coverage. So the British actually adopted the policy of having smaller numbers, or fewer number of guns, more spots. And afterwards, the realization was we should have gone the way the Germans tended to do, which was to have larger installations. At the DQ line, there was one post the Canadians captured where they had 23 machine guns. So that's deployment and employment, so we'll use that as a context. Why should we care about our infantry weapons? We know artillery was the great killer. 58% of the wounded the British suffered were caused by artillery. The comparable German number for the period just after Vimy was 78% of their wounded were caused by British artillery. Further, I have a book coming out in late summer on the Canadian operations on the Somme, where I did an evaluation of every Canadian battalion attack, of which there were 62. 57 were contested, and I evaluated them as to how successful they were, from all the way from fully successful to an outright failure. And where the Canadian artillery was rated as being effective, something like 94% of the attacks had some degree of success, which argues infantry weapons weren't really that important. However, if you move the scope a little bit out and look at all of the attacks, there's suddenly 37% of the attacks, there is an opportunity for infantry to have had a role. And even into 1918, even during the 100 Days campaign, Canadian artillery was not conquering all before it. There were still failures. Now, if we take a look at a battle at the Somme, say this is a typical sort of engagement where there are 3 formations attacking, you end up with what was called a patchy situation, where you have a series of patches. And further to the point about the learning organization, after the Somme, the Canadian Corps distributed a detailed questionnaire down to the battalion level. One of the questions they asked was, what do you do about patches? And the response was, try again. Basically, you need to insert reserves, replan an artillery barrage, and in terms of the Somme, that's going to take a day, which allows the Germans a lot of time to recover. So, and why is that, sorry, I'm going too fast here. Why is that an issue? That's because on the Somme, the Canadian infantry was pretty much restricted to using bombs, bullets, and bayonets to take on German strongpoints. And if you're attacking German machine gun nests with bombs, bullets, and bayonets, you're going to suffer a lot of losses, and you're probably going to fail. Further, there's a period, certainly in the Somme and pretty much throughout the entire war, where there's, say, 2 to 3 hours where neither side's artillery is entirely confident about the location of both their own forces and the enemy. So the result is, during this period, the artillery is playing off stage. The Germans are firing in no man's land, the Canadians are firing a protective barrage. It's up to the infantry to fix the patchy situation. But even if the artillery is able to fire, there are limitations. For the Canadians, there was a minimum 200-yard distance between your friendly forces and the enemy before you could have 18-pounders fire. It was 400 yards for 4.5-inch howitzers and 600 to 800 yards for heavy artillery. So it was up to the infantry to fight those battles when you're getting in close in situations. So there is definitely a role for the infantry weapons. So, first case study, Stokes Mortar. It's basically a tube with a heavy base. I think most serving officers would recognize that this is not very different from the weapons that they have today. It's quite effective. The explosive filling of a Stokes Mortar round is greater than that of an 18-pounder. It can have a crash fire rate of 20 rounds a minute. Quite an effective weapon, right? Speeds and feeds. It's organized in the British and the Canadians as an 8-gun battery at the brigade level, led by a captain, and it's staffed by personnel seconded from the brigade's infantry. So what does your average infantry colonel do when they're tasked with assigning people? Well, they're going to get their malcontents, the shirkers, the unpopular. So as a result, trench mortar batteries tend to have a really poor reputation. I think Mark referred to the poor soldier that was suffering from shell shock, ended up with the 5th Brigade Trench Mortar Battery. What's more, they're disliked by the infantry in trench warfare conditions because they sneak in, they fire 20 rounds, they scamper off, and then the poor infantry faces the German retaliation, the work and casualties that result. So how are they used on the Somme? Because in theory, this is a really effective weapon. It's got more firepower than an 18-pounder, and it's usually under the control of the battalion commander. How's it used? It's not. So 13% of the respondents reported actually using the Stokes Mortar. They typically end up being stationed at the battalion headquarters, which is so far in the rear that it can't fire on the German front line. It's used primarily as a defensive weapon. Why? It's logistics. So a typical 4-man crew can maybe, if you're lucky, carry 4 rounds each. So that's less than a minute. So they can do essentially 1 fire mission at a time. And as a result, they're not regarded as being very useful. So what happens at Vimy? Well, some battalions figure out, hey, this is a really powerful weapon. One of the reserve battalions was assigning 25 men to each gun to carry ammunition. But throughout the war, even into the 100 Days campaign, there's thick correspondence from battalions complaining about how poorly structured the trench mortars are, problems with mobility, problems with logistics. That was never actually adequately solved. And this is a case where things weren't properly learned. The second case is the Lewis gun, arguably the best light machine gun of the First World War. It's light only in the sense that it's half the weight of a Vickers machine gun. It has a relatively high rate of fire, quite reliable, quite an effective weapon. It's manned with a crew of up to 5, can carry 30 magazines. Each magazine carries 47 rounds. So it can sustain a pretty good rate of fire for an appreciable amount of time. Further, there's 2 per company. But they are not integrated into the company structure. They are considered specialists. So in this questionnaire on the Somme, they were very highly regarded. Everyone universally loved them. So should be a great weapon, right? Well, they're used almost exclusively defensively. There's only one instance that I saw that they were used offensively. Why is that? That's because on the Somme, the basic battle formation is a company, and the poor company commander has to control up to 10 units. At the beginning of the battle, they're majors. By the second tour or third tour, they're usually junior lieutenants that are commanding a battalion. So they're having to handle 10 maneuver units on a front of 200 to 300 yards with a depth of 200. It's impossible. As a result, every unit kind of ends up fighting its own battle. What happens at Vimy? Well, there's the reorganization that we've heard about of where they're become a fundamental part of a platoon. So now when you hit a German strong point, you have the Lewis gun and the rifle grenades to suppress the German fire, and you have your maneuver units to be able to outflank and take out the position. And you see this in Vimy, that first objective pretty much all wiped out, no problem. But when you get to the second and third objectives, the Germans start to recover. And the Canadians are able now to maneuver. They now have more than bombs, bullets, and bayonets in order to take out the positions. So, in summary, I hope what I've been able to convince you is that we need to look at more than speeds and feeds, but as to how weapons are deployed and employed, and how those decisions actually have a dramatic effect on the effectiveness of the unit. And then finally, infantry weapons matter. Even in a war as dominated by artillery, there are still interstitial moments where the infantry has to be able to fight forward with their own firepower. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Markus.
So let me see if this works. Well, just a short remark on a question that came up this morning regarding the title of the magazine, Der wahre Jakob, that one lady asked. If I remember correctly, the title refers to a German saying which goes back to the Old Testament, and the true Jacob, the wahre Jakob, means more or less the core of the matter, or an English equivalent would be the real McCoy in a way. So it's not 100% the same, but it goes in this direction. So, all right, let's start. The author Ernst Jünger, 1895 to 1998, is probably the most well-known non-fictional German soldier of the Great War. Jünger, who had volunteered for the infantry, served from December 1914 until August 1918 and was wounded 7 times. He received the Iron Cross in both classes and the highest Prussian Order of Merit, the Pour le Mérite. After the war, Jünger continued service in the Reichswehr before he became a professional writer. His memoirs, Storm of Steel, first publication in 1920 and translated into English in 1929, made him an internationally renowned war writer, or écrivain combattant, as the French term defines it more aptly. Right to this day, his writings define our image of the Western Front, of trench warfare, or war in general to a very high degree, I would argue. After 1945, in the Federal Republic in Germany, Jünger faced considerable criticism for his interbellum writings. The accusation aimed at his assumed glorification of war and violence. And during the 1970s and 80s in particular, Jünger became demonized as an aesthetic vanguard for proto-fascist warrior ideology, whereas his literary entanglement with the anti-democratic forces in Weimar Germany is beyond question for me. The appraisal of his Great War writing text has clearly changed since then. One reason was the posthumous publication of his actual war diaries in 2010. These diaries had served as the narrative baseline for Storm of Steel, but both texts are very different indeed, and now we are able to compare. And if my observation is correct, the image of the military Jünger is in an interesting process of deconstruction and reconstruction in the German literary community. Ernst Jünger's participation in the 1916 Battle of the Somme and in the German Spring Offensive of 1918 is pretty well known, but it is less known that he also took part in the 1917 Battle of Vimy Ridge and Alleux, provided you count the latter as a separate battle. So what I would like to do is to accompany you down to the micro-tactical level of warfare, the level of an individual junior officer, and I would like to take a closer look at his at the particular episode of this young man's war on the basis of the news sources that I mentioned before. In order to follow the man, we must have a brief look at the institutional environment, the regiment. For the duration of the war, Ernst Jünger served in the Prussian Fusilier Regiment number 73, a unit with some peculiarities. First of all, Fusilier in 1914 was just a traditional denomination for the unit. It had its garrison in the wonderful city of Hanover. As a first special feature, it is worthwhile mentioning that this regiment had fought on the Western Front alone, only. This was very consequential for both the unit's learning process and Ernst Jünger's perception of the war. Special feature number 2 is that at least 3 well-known German writers served in this unit. Ernst Jünger himself, his brother Friedrich Georg, who was a poet and an essayist, and finally Hermann Löns, we mentioned him this morning, a very popular author who already died in 1914. And last but not least, this regiment had a particular British tradition insofar as it had earned a reputation as one of King George III's foreign regiments during the defense of Gibraltar. In 1793, the regiment received from the king the honorary denomination as the Gibraltar Regiment. The German Emperor Wilhelm II acknowledged this tradition in 1901 by awarding the unit with a unique blue-colored cuff title. So the Canadians who went up the ridge in 1917 fought, if you want, against a British regiment and one that had defended a rock before. On the eve of the Battle of Vimy, the regiment formed part of the 111th Infantry Division, which had just finished a tour of construction work along the Siegfriedstellung, known as the Hindenburg Line in British military history. On April 6th, the regiment moved in a reserve position. Let's see. Okay, so the red does not come out very well, but you can differentiate between the blue and the red lines here. In the sector of Lens, Hénon, Liétard, and Douai. That means right behind the ridge. On the evening of April 9th, Fusilier Regiment 73 was temporarily attached to the 79th Reserve Division that bore the brunt of the Canadian attack on the strong points of Vimy and Farbus. On the next morning, the regiment ordered its 2nd Battalion to approach the ridge. It suffered heavily during this approach through curtain fire. At the same time, the 1st Battalion, Jünger's battalion, took a defensive position in Fresnoy. So did the 3rd Battalion around Arles. And let's see, this is the situation. Sorry, this is one. We're still here. On the 14th, now we move on. The 79th Reserve Division, including the 2nd Battalion of the regiment, was ordered to retreat to this reserve position. 1st Battalion remained in Fresnoy, the 3rd moved to Villers near Flers, and the battered 2nd Battalion went to Arles. The following days saw the continuation of the fighting around the so-called Arles-Nase, the Arles Bulge, with a regular rotation of the battalions. When the Canadian attack on Arles was launched on the 28th, 3rd Battalion was quickly surrounded and annihilated on the very same day. Now the Fresnoy position, home of Jünger's battalion, had become the regiment's first line. 2 days later, on April 30th, the regiment was relieved and marched into the hinterland. On May 3rd, the Fresnoy position was taken. So the regiment fighting around Vimy was defined by a rather unpleasant weather condition, which was a universal problem for all the soldiers involved: snowfall, rain, hasty mobilization, and the detrimental effect of the barrage behind the ridge during the first 2 days. I will leave a broad assessment of the German Sixth Army's defensive position on the ridge to my colleague Christian Stachelbeck, who will talk later. As to the regiment, we can observe heavy casualties for the 2nd Battalion in the first 2 days, whereas the other 2 battalions remained rather unmolested. It took until April 24th, when the situation was becoming more and more strained in the Arles sector, resulting in the loss of the 3rd Battalion on 28th. At this point, the German line had been transformed into a loosely connected network of crater positions. So, 2nd Lieutenant Jünger served as a platoon leader in the 2nd Company 1st Battalion. He had been on leave in early April. As it happened, he reported back to the regimental headquarters around about midday on April 9th, so very bad timing. In this situation, the regimental staff was pretty occupied with the upcoming alarm, so Jünger received the order to lead the 1st Battalion's bagage to Beaumont. The following day, the 10th, the battalion moved to Fresnoy, where Jünger had to set up an observation post. So it appears that his late return from leave had inhibited his reassignment to his actual position as a platoon leader. Instead, he was ditched to some special purpose mission. We call it ZBV in German military parlance. On April 12 and 13, we find him detached from his unit as a traffic controller on the crossroad Arles-Fresnoy, Fresnoy OP. The entry in his diary leaves no doubt about the relevance of his mission, and I quote, "I sat in my cold hut that luckily for me stood right at the corner. I ordered the corporal to summon every passerby. After 7 hours, I retreated happily to my basement, and I slept like a log until 1300 hours." On April 14th, I try to get back the situation on the 14th, Jünger received the order to set up a regimental communication post, a Nachrichtensammelstelle at Fresnoy. He was therefore given 42 soldiers, including runners, telephone, radio, signaling lamp operators, and carrier pigeons. It appears that Jünger rather doubted the practicality of this post, but under the impression of the events ahead of Fresnoy, he quickly came to terms with this new situation. For April 50th, his diary states, quote, "Life seems to be quite cozy here. Actually, everything runs autonomously. My only job is to keep an eye on the general order and on joint action." He spent the following 5 days establishing contact with adjacent communication posts. During these days' trip on foot, on a bicycle, Jünger paid a visit to the villages of Hénon-l'Étard, Arles, Drocourt, and Bois-Bernat. On the 17th, he wrote, quote, "So far, I've had nothing to do. My basement is furnished snugly and warm, and I'm spending comfortable days." Well, you have to connect this to the tactical situation that was beginning to change during these days and the situation of the ongoing battle. On the 20th, this comfortable situation was beginning to change when heavy artillery was zeroing in on Fresnoy, including his snug basement. Ernst Jünger now switched into an individualized mode of defense in the depth. He quickly left his basement, and the diary we find the note, quote, "I went down the farm track to Bois-Bernat to gain a more distant look at this situation. 1 day later, April 21st, Jünger evaded the heavy bombardment of Fresnoy with a trip to Hénon-l'Étard in order to, quote, "get some new reed and to have a decent shave at the local barber shop." At this point, it appears that he had been forgotten by his superiors. On April 23rd, the situation in Fresnoy became hairy. In the meantime, the village had been largely destroyed, and to his disfavor, Jünger now identified heavy 12-inch artillery shells around Fresnoy. For the following 5 days, the diary provides no indication on further excursions. Instead, Jünger spent the days reading and playing cards in his basement, thereby eagerly noting the timing, the extent, and the location of the bombardment. On the 25th, his signaling equipment was destroyed and the capacity of his communication post limited. On the 27th, that is 13 days after the setting up of the communication post, a first important radio message was received, warning against an immediate attack. The next day, 28th, the silent days of Fresnoy were over. Jünger's basement was hit and destroyed. He himself remained uninjured. The basement of the adjacent house was also destroyed, with the grenade killing 3 of Jünger's soldiers and injuring 1. In the evening, he received the information that Arles was taken and that the 3rd Battalion was lost. Now rifle fire could be heard in the vicinity, which in turn prompted Jünger to ask for permission to pack up the post and to retreat. 2 days later, on the 30th, the Fusilier Regiment 37 was taken out from the front line. Jünger marched to Flers via Beaumont to Flers, and this was where, for the first time and last time during the battle, he had actually to execute physical violence when confronted with 3 German sergeants who had occupied his billet room. Quote, "Reckless energy, the battle-hardened veteran of Fresnoy noted in his diary, is the only remedy against this Lord Muck attitude and the swaggering of these base wallers. So the quotation in the original sounds like a grand seigneur gebaren and baronisieren der Etappenschweine. So what he was trying to do is getting these other people out from the billet and the room that he had been, was his room in his way. So to come to a conclusion, the episode, uneventful as it might appear at first glance, opens a surprising perspective on the realities of 1917 Western Front combat. It reveals the specter of individual survival strategies, and it enables us to question the author's later narrative in his Storm of Steel. But at the same time, the episode enables us to question the critical counter-narrative of those who took Jünger's self-image at face value and turned it against him. Did the man behind the ridge live the war essence in Jünger, fighter type, and as a cynical observer of destruction? Certainly not. The analysis of his war diaries shows Jünger's situation between the 9th and 30s, which was first of all determined by a series of contingencies. He arrived late for the battle, therefore reassignment to his actual and unquestionably more dangerous job as a platoon leader had to be postponed, as it turned out, for nearly a month. For the duration of the battle, Lieutenant Jünger was moved around on ad hoc jobs. His memoirs might be formally correct. His regiment had fought on Vimy Ridge, but neither his battalion nor he himself. When the 2nd Battalion fought an embittered battle on the ridge on the 10th, Jünger and his 1st Battalion moved into a reserve position pretty unmolested. When 3rd Battalion was destroyed on the 28th, again, his battalion had just left the scene in a regular rotation scheme. The Vimy episodes fits in a series of fortuities that might be a clue to explaining Jünger's survival. A thorough day-to-day assessment of the diary reveals that Ernst Jünger happened to be on regular leave, on training course, or in hospital whenever his regiment suffered most. Besides his graduation from school in the summer of 1914 and his hospitalization in the summer of 1918 made him miss out on the most lethal phases of the Great War, the first and the last 3 months. To put it pointedly, his frequent injuries saved him from death. And Vimy, I would say, is a very good example for these contingencies. But Jünger's situation in Fresnoy was not a result of external contingencies alone. As a witty soldier, he had played quite a role in its coming about. In order to explain this, I propose to identify observation and movement as the two guiding principles. All right, this is... The reader of the chapter in Storm of Steel will easily get under the impression that the description of the bombardment were driven by the author's ecstatic motivation. Similar description in other chapters of the book are even stronger in depicting the sound of battle, the sight of battle, the impression of battle. This has led commentators to the conclusion that Ernst Jünger found some kind of artistic satisfaction in the destruction of men and the landscape. However, the reading of the diary reveals that the permanent and synesthetic observation was a vital precondition for survival on the battlefield. What types of shells appeared, where, and how often. The acoustic and seismic pattern could allow a conclusion with regard to the enemy's action and intentions. Apart from observation, movement served as Jünger's second survival technique in the Vimy environment. It goes without saying that it is an essential task of any leader of a communication post to establish contact with his neighbors. But for keeping up this contact, it might have been sufficient to send out one of his men. Jünger alludes in his diary at one point that he was not convinced of the post necessity anyway. So why this unsteady rambling around? The answer will be obvious if we bring together the two techniques, observation and movement. As an experienced soldier, Jünger had realized the imminence for his habitat, and he took a professional assessment. He traded in the risk of being accidentally wounded by a shrapnel in open ground against the risk of being targeted by heavy artillery in his village. And if we take the statement of April 20 I mentioned earlier, I went down the farm track to Bois Bernard to gain a more distant look to the situation. It becomes clear that the purpose of this walk was not to satisfy his pathological lust for destruction, but because it appears much more appropriate to watch the destruction of his own habitat from a certain distance. During the days of Fresnoy, Ernst Jünger enjoyed a freedom rarely granted to soldiers in the Great War, and that was to determine its own standpoint, and I mean this in the very literal sense of the word. He chose his standpoint with extreme consideration, and he showed no intention to jeopardize this privileged situation by any means. At no point in the diary we find an indicator that Ernst Jünger felt a heroic impulse to move into the direction of the action. So what can we learn from this as historians? First of all, I think the episode reminds us of the enormous diversity of the experience of combat in the Great War, and perhaps even beyond. It reminds us that when assessing the seductive narrative of battle, we have to scrutinize the individual and the organizations alike. Yes, Fusilier Regiment 73 fought on Vimy Ridge and it suffered severely, but no, its most prominent soldiers, Ernst Jünger, had experienced violence passively at best and in a comparatively safe environment during the episode of the war. The Fresnoy story also helps us to peek beyond the rather narrow frame of the heroic narrative. This protagonist did not survive the war because he overcame his enemies one by one and at arm's blanche's length. He survived because he was an alert observer, one that calculated a risk and took an opportunity. So Jünger's Fresnoy approach to battle was not his only way to deal with the lethal conditions of modern warfare, but it was one that we should not underrate or overlook. Thank you very much.
Well, two fascinating and in some ways provocative, quite provocative papers. Thank you, gentlemen, for the enlightening comments. We have about 10 minutes for questions, if there are any from the floor. Could I ask you please to move to the microphones because we're having a little bit of trouble with the dead air up here.
Hi, my name's Clark Seaborn. I'm just a amateur historian. A question for Dr. Stewart. I was aware that the Lewis gun was used on aircraft all the time, where short bursts and a lot of cooling air made them very suitable, but I wasn't aware that they were used on the ground. How easy was it to change a barrel that became melted? What did they weigh as a stock and bipod equipped Lewis? And what does the pannier of?
Well, unlike the Vickers, you didn't change the barrel very often, so it was air cooled. So yes, it's like all machine guns. You tend to fire it in short bursts so that you don't want to blow off your whole magazine all at one go. It weighed about 27 pounds, which is about half the weight of a Vickers machine gun. And it was eventually fitted up with slings so that you could carry it over your shoulder or have the sling over your shoulder and fire while you're marching. So you could get marching fire with it, which is something the French had been doing with their particular weapons since 1915.
Did the soldier use his urine to keep the barrel cool?
Yeah, well, you were equipped with a special asbestos glove to be able to help carry it. Post-war, they actually had a handle that they mounted on it so that you could haul it around. But in theory, you were supposed to have this glove to help shield you from the heat.
Okay, thank you.
Sir?
Oh, hi. Laurie Johnson from the Calgary Highlanders Museum. Question for Dr. Stewart. During the Somme, you stated that the Lewis guns were operated by specialist troops, whereby Vimy, not only were there more Lewis guns, but were they still operated by specialist troops, or by Vimy was the average platoon member trained, as was the case with the Bren gun and today with the C9?
Yeah, that's actually one of the issues, that one of the differences between the Canadians and the British was that half of the recruits or half of the troops were supposed to be trained in England on the Lewis gun, whereas in England all the Lewis gun training was done when it was deployed in France. And one of the issues is that when the number of Lewis guns was doubled, it essentially almost everybody in a battalion was supposed to be trained on a Lewis gun. The notion is that you need to have at least one spare crew and ideally 2 spare crews for every gun, because the Germans recognized how powerful the weapon was. And one of the problems was on the Somme was nominally the Canadian Corps was supposed to have, they aimed to have 12 to 16 Lewis guns per battalion, but they could never keep that number because the Germans targeted the Lewis gunners. And so one of the questions in that questionnaire was, where should the Lewis guns be in an attack wave? And the decision was normally well at the back, because they were the first people to get targeted, because the Germans recognized just how useful. In fact, they tried to capture as many as they could. They formed battalions based on the Lewis gun.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Cooper.
This is a question for Dr. Pöhlmann. I'll start with an anecdote. As you probably know, we have exchange students from the Helmut Schmidt University coming here. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. One of the books that I assigned in the war courses, Storm of Steel, and one of the young officers said this is the 4th time he's read this book. The first time he was in high school when he decided to be a soldier. The second time was in basic training, and the third time was when he went to officer school. And this was the 4th time. He just seemed to enjoy it enormously. But my question is, a few years ago, Holger told me about the war diary. I haven't read it. I read an excerpt in Der Spiegel. And your remarks raised the really interesting question. Why was there such a difference between what Jünger wrote in his war diary, which was about as much of the misery of trench warfare as you'll find in any of the British stuff that we've had to read since the poets in high school. And in Storm of Steel, it was like it was a great lark. He says he can sleep through a barrage. So far as I know, he's the only person in the world that could do that. Why the difference between what actually happened as it's recorded in his war diary and then what came out in this many-time edited best-selling book about what he says happened?
That's a very good question. And that was a question that Ernst Jünger was asking himself during the war, because from the war diary you can identify a point where he actually coming back from a leave, visiting his father and his family, and in a discussion with the father, he comes up with the idea, I want to make something out of my war diary. And that happens in mid-1917 or so. That's the point where he decides to to make the war diary the basis for a later publication. So I'm not a literary historian or someone who's into literature. A specialist would probably be able to identify a change in the doctor's, the wording and the ideas that he comes up. So that would bring us closer to the answer to his question. Why is it different? I think this goes for all the post-1918 publication. You are trying to rationalize your your experiences, and you have to bring some order into the weird and chaotic and brutal things that you have seen and heard and felt, and you have to come up with a story, with a plot that was not there when you actually lived through these episodes, which were loosely connected and seemed chaotic and strange. And he's someone who, and you see this in the diary as well, he's someone who has a certain laconic approach to the word. So that's one of the accusations, that he has this aesthetic, he's not empathy, he has no empathy, and he's not reflecting on the whole war situation, and he's a very solitary figure who's laconic. I believe him if he says he slept through a barrage. Why not? People did that. I'm sure that other people did that too. If you're so long in a tense situation, a barrage becomes normal for you. For some people, we can't imagine this. But why not? I propose to take this for granted. But then, of course, he takes this event and he makes something out of it, and because it's such a good story, of course.
Say on the Canadian side, like for instance, on the Somme, the 18th Battalion's war diary for September was 18 pages. Another battalion in the same brigade was 256 pages. So there's a very different view on the importance of having a historical record between the two formations.
Thank you. Sir, last question.
Rory Corey from the Military Museums here in Calgary. Question for Dr. Stewart, particularly on the role, or I suppose both the deployment and the employment of the Mills bomb during the war. So at Vimy, we know that there were bombers basically carrying bagfuls of the Mills bombs there, but you mentioned before that there were issues with, if you increase the number of machine guns, you then decrease correspondingly the amount of ammunition that you can carry. So I'm just wondering, did they accumulate several months worth of regular supply of Mills bombs to enable them to have bombers with bagfuls of Mills bombs? Or were they only able to employ them for the very initial stages of the battle? Did bombers continue on as a role longer term? What was the supply and employment like?
Well, the issue with bombs was not the supply at the dumps. It's getting the supply forward. So one of the attacks on the Somme, I think it was the 3rd Battalion on the 8th of October, carried 3,000 hand grenades into the battle, and they used them all and were eventually driven out when they ran out of the supply of grenades. And there were, I think, something like 10,000 grenades in the brigade dump, but they could not get them forward because of the German interdiction fire. So the issue is, in most cases, is that there was an ample supply of every form of ammunition. It's just a problem of moving this stuff because it weighs a lot and you use a lot. So a battery of machine guns can fire 16,000 rounds in 2 hours. Each grenade weighs a little over a pound. So if you're using that's 3,000 pounds of weight that you have to move around. And during the Somme, that's probably the nadir of infantry tactics for the Canadians. The battle really resolved around who's going to run out of grenades first. And whoever did lost. And the Germans are fighting defensively. They've got dumps, they've got communication trenches where they can get reinforcements, whereas the Canadians are having to resupply through no man's land. They usually end up losing as a result.
Thank you.
Well, let me, on behalf of everyone here, thank our 4 presenters for these 2 sets of panels, and in particular Will and Markus for this fascinating conclusion to the discussion about air power and infantry. We have a break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 3 o'clock for the operational learning section. Thank you.